At first, it seemed like the most ridiculous idea, burying a Quonset hut against an ancient boulder. In a land where snow and freezing winds ruled, no one believed it could withstand the cold. But 9 days later, something impossible happened. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The biting wind swept through the valley, howling down from the snow-capped peaks that surrounded the isolated wilderness. The snow lay deep on the ground, each flake a reminder of the relentless cold that would soon engulf the land. Yet, as the wind stung and the snow settled, one man stood outside, staring at an unlikely structure nestled against a giant boulder. It was a Quonset hut, an oddity in the landscape, built from corrugated steel and pressed against the massive rock like a child's toy, too large for its surroundings. To anyone who looked at it, the idea seemed foolish, an old worn structure in the middle of a place where only the strongest survived. The thought of the hut holding against the coming storms, the weight of the snow, and the brutal cold seemed laughable. Most would have built a cabin, a structure of wood and stone, something that looked like it belonged in the wilderness, strong enough to stand against bears and storms. But this man, his face weathered and covered by a thick beard, had chosen something different. A Quonset hut, not for style, but for survival. It had been his decision to turn this metal shell into a sanctuary, to push its limits in ways others had never thought possible. He had watched the wind tear at his old cabin, the drafts creeping through every crack, the heat slipping away as soon as it was kindled. He had lived through winters where the cold gnawed at his bones, leaving him cold even inside his own home. This time, he wouldn't settle for tradition. He needed something more. He needed a fortress against the elements. His plan was simple: place the hut against the giant boulder, a natural barrier that could provide shelter from the worst of the storms. The rock's mass would help insulate the structure, shielding it from the worst winds. It was an untested idea, and many thought it would fail. But he had faith in his unconventional choice. He had no choice but to make it work. He stood there for a moment, eyes squinting against the rising wind, a glimmer of hope buried beneath the uncertainty. The sun was dipping low, and the light cast long shadows over the mountains. He turned, looking at the smoke curling from the chimney of the hut. The fire inside still burned, and for the first time in days, he felt the warmth wrap around him. This was just the beginning. The fire crackled loudly inside the Quonset hut as the man worked tirelessly. He had already spent hours securing the corrugated steel to the rock, attaching the sheets with heavy bolts, making sure each layer was tightly sealed. Every piece had to be just right. The work was grueling, but in the face of this desolation, there was no room for error. As he hammered the last steel sheet into place, he stepped back to admire the structure. It wasn't much to look at, a simple, curved shell, but it was his. Every inch of it had been built with his own hands, his own labor. It wasn't a traditional cabin with sturdy beams and hand-hewn logs, but it had something those cabins didn't: potential. He wiped the sweat from his brow, though the chill in the air should have made it impossible to perspire. But he was used to the strange paradox of mountain life. Even as the temperature dropped below freezing, the exertion of his work kept him warm. It wasn't a perfect solution, but he had come to realize that the wilderness didn't offer perfect solutions, only the possibility of survival. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small metal tool, a pocket thermometer he had used on previous trips to gauge the temperature. The mercury inside had frozen during the last storm, leaving him with only the faintest idea of how cold it truly was. But that didn't matter now. The real test would come when the snow began to fall again, when the winds howled and the cold crept in. In the days that followed, the man worked hard to improve the insulation, packing snow around the hut, using canvas and tarps to cover any gaps. He had a rudimentary knowledge of heat conservation, having lived through enough winters to understand how heat worked. The trick was to trap it, to keep it contained as much as possible. Inside the hut, he had built a simple stone fireplace, its chimney rising from the roof, a thin trail of smoke drifting into the sky. He had to make sure the fire was never extinguished, even on the coldest nights. But the real question was whether it would hold. Would this Quonset hut really be able to keep him warm when the temperatures plummeted? When the wind cut through the valley, how long could he survive with the fire as his only source of heat? The first night came, and the wind began to pick up. It howled through the trees, rattling the walls of the hut. The man sat by the fire, his eyes darting nervously between the walls and the door. Would it hold, or would he be forced to seek shelter elsewhere? He wrapped his thick woolen blanket around his shoulders and waited, each moment stretching into the next. The night passed in silence, the wind continuing to roar outside. But inside the hut, the warmth never faded. The fire burned steadily, keeping the space comfortable, though just barely. It wasn't the roaring blaze of summer warmth, but it was enough to keep the frost from creeping in, enough to make him feel like he might survive another day. By morning, the wind had settled, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. The man stood at the door, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, his heart still pounding from the tension of the night before. The Quonset hut had survived, for now. The morning came with a silence that seemed unnatural in the mountains. The storm had passed, but the air was still biting, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into every bone, every joint. The man stood outside the Quonset hut, staring at the thick layer of snow that had settled around the base of the rock. The sky was overcast, a dull gray that matched the bleakness of the landscape. There was no warmth in sight. As he stepped out of the hut, his boots crunched through the snow, the sound of his movements echoing in the stillness. The wind had died down, but the cold remained. He pulled his fur-lined coat tighter around him and began walking toward the edge of the clearing. His breath clouded in front of him, a steady plume of vapor that dissolved into the frigid air. He had to check the hut's exterior, make sure the metal sheets were still secure against the boulder. The previous night had been the first real test of the structure's ability to keep out the cold. He had built it with meticulous care, but there was always doubt when it came to survival. Doubt that no amount of preparation could truly erase. The snow crunched under his feet as he circled the hut, inspecting the joints where the steel sheets met the rock. There were no signs of weakness, no gaps where the snow had drifted inside, no hints that the metal was buckling under the weight of the storm. It was holding, just as he had hoped. But the real test wasn't the outside. The true challenge was the inside, the warmth, the life-sustaining heat that the hut could provide. He had relied on the stone fireplace for warmth, stacking firewood in the corner, making sure the chimney was clear. The fire inside was still going strong, the crackling of the logs inside filling the space with a comforting sound. The warmth radiated out in waves, keeping the cold at bay, but it wasn't enough to convince him that it was permanent. Not yet. The night before, he had watched the smoke from the chimney billow out into the cold, his only link to the outside world. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, but it was a signal that the fire was still burning. The warmth from that fire was all that kept the cold from creeping in. The man turned and walked back to the hut, his mind racing. Could it really hold up to the depths of winter? Could this metal shell really be his refuge for the long months ahead? Or was he just fooling himself, relying on hope rather than reason? He stepped inside, the warmth hitting him like a wave. The fire crackled in the corner, sending off a gentle heat that made the air inside feel almost comfortable. His body, still chilled from the outside, began to relax. He pulled off his coat and sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting as the warmth crept into his limbs. The fire would be the key. It always was. And with that fire, he would test the Quonset hut again. One night wasn't enough. He needed more time. The second night brought with it the same biting cold, but this time the man was prepared. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees and rattling the steel walls of the Quonset hut. The temperature plummeted even further, and the snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes, covering the landscape in an endless white sheet. It was the kind of night that would make most people seek shelter somewhere warmer, somewhere safer. But not the man. Not now. He had learned the hard way that survival in the wilderness wasn't just about finding shelter. It was about holding on to that shelter when the elements tried to tear it apart. He had seen others fail, cabins ripped apart by storms, doors torn off their hinges by the fury of the wind. He couldn't afford to let that happen to him. Not now. He sat near the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance as the wind screamed outside. His hands shook as he worked to stoke the fire, adding more wood to the already burning pile. The flames flared up, casting long shadows on the curved walls of the hut. The heat was intense, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. It never did. The fire would burn through the night, and he would have to make sure it never went out. He had learned to trust the fire in ways most people never would. He knew the signs of a dying flame, the way it would flicker out when the wood ran low, how the air inside would grow colder and colder until the hut was as cold as the world outside. That wasn't going to happen tonight. The man sat by the fire, eyes flicking between the logs and the cold gray sky outside. The wind howled and screamed, but inside the hut he was safe. The warmth from the fire was like a thin thread that kept him tethered to the world, a lifeline to something beyond the cold and the darkness. Hours passed and the wind outside intensified. The temperature continued to drop, and the snow piled higher against the hut's metal sides. He couldn't afford to sleep, not yet, not until he knew the hut could survive through the night. He kept his eyes on the fire, feeding it as needed, watching the way the flames licked at the wood and sent up bursts of heat. Each small piece of wood he added was a promise that he would make it through. The night dragged on, the wind pushing harder against the walls. But inside, the warmth held steady. He could feel it deep in his bones as the fire burned bright and strong. His eyelids grew heavy with exhaustion, but he fought it, knowing he couldn't afford to fall asleep. Not now. And then, in the early hours of the morning, the wind finally began to ease. The storm outside started to die down, and the snowflakes turned into a soft flurry, barely moving in the stillness. The fire was still burning, though the embers were low. He had made it through the night. As the first light of morning crept into the hut, he allowed himself to lean back against the wall and close his eyes. The battle with the cold wasn't over, but for now, he had won. The Quonset hut had held, just as he had hoped. The warmth had not faded. He had made it through another night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests. But for now, he had survived. The cold continued its unrelenting assault on the valley, each gust of wind testing the limits of the Quonset hut's strange resilience. The snow had begun to pile up higher now, almost to the roof, turning the surrounding world into a white, blinding sheet of frozen wilderness. But within the metal walls, the man sat by the fire, absorbed in the crackling flames. He had learned to listen to the fire, understand its rhythms, and respect its power. It was no longer just a source of warmth. It was his companion, his protector. But as the fire flickered and crackled, a thought gnawed at him in the back of his mind. The hut had survived the cold. It had passed the first test. Yet there was something he couldn't ignore, something he hadn't truly prepared for. The wind. The wind was a force of nature that couldn't be ignored. It whistled through the valley, finding cracks, crevices, and weaknesses in anything that stood in its path. The Quonset hut, though sturdy, was not impervious to the unseen forces of nature that had shaped this wilderness. The metal walls, though tightly fastened to the rock, creaked and groaned with every gust. There was a certain tension in the air, an unease that the man couldn't shake. He stood up, stretching his stiff legs, and moved toward the door. The wind had picked up once again, howling louder than before, and the temperature had dropped even further. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and opened the door cautiously, stepping outside into the frigid night. The first thing that struck him was the absolute silence. The wind had ceased its howling for a moment, leaving only the soft hiss of snowflakes as they gently landed on the ground. It was eerie. He looked out over the snow-covered landscape, eyes squinting against the falling snow. Nothing. The world was completely still. And then suddenly he noticed it. A subtle shift in the air. The metal of the Quonset hut was vibrating. He could feel it beneath his feet, the tremor of something just under the surface. The wind had not stopped. It had merely shifted direction, now bearing down on the hut from the side. He could see the snow drifting off the roof, blown off by the wind that no longer seemed to circle, but instead slammed directly against the structure. The rock had shielded the front of the hut, but now the full force of the storm was testing its integrity. He rushed back inside, closing the door behind him. He glanced at the fire. It still burned strong, but his concern grew. The walls groaned again, louder now, as if the wind was looking for weaknesses. He had not anticipated this kind of pressure on the hut. The design was solid, but this kind of force was new. The man stood still for a moment, listening intently. His instinct screamed at him that he was missing something, that there was more to this than the cold and the snow. He had built the Quonset hut to withstand nature's fiercest forces, but this storm was different. The elements, he realized, were not merely testing his shelter. They were trying to break him. The wind had picked up again by dawn, its howling force shaking the walls of the Quonset hut. The man woke to the sound of it, rattling the steel sheets and the soft scraping of snow against the door. His body ached from the cold, his bones heavy with the weight of another night spent fighting nature's brutal hand. But despite the discomfort, there was a strange sense of peace in the air. He had made it through the night. The hut had held. He rose from the makeshift bed, a pile of thick furs and blankets that kept the worst of the chill at bay. His breath clouded in front of him as he stood, the fire still burning low but steady in the corner. It wasn't the roaring blaze of earlier days, but it was enough. It always had been. The storm outside had not relented. It had only intensified, its wind pushing harder against the hut. He could feel it now, the pressure, the way the structure groaned as the gusts hit from new angles. The boulder behind him, which had once seemed like a perfect shield, no longer seemed as impenetrable. The wind had shifted, forcing the cold to pour in from the sides, attacking the hut's most vulnerable points. He moved quickly to check the walls, the steel sheets vibrating beneath his touch. The roof was still holding strong, but the walls were a different story. He had thought the metal would be enough, but the wind's force was something he hadn't fully considered. The Quonset hut, though sturdy, was built to handle a certain kind of pressure. This was new. This was something different. The man's mind raced as he inspected the structure. His hands shook not from the cold, but from a growing realization that the hut was not as invulnerable as he had hoped. The wind's unrelenting assault was pushing the limits of his creation, and it would only grow worse. The storm wasn't going to pass any time soon, and the temperature would continue to drop. He couldn't afford to let the fire die. Not now. Not when the wind was closing in from every side. He moved back to the fire and stoked it, adding more wood to the pile. He had to keep the warmth inside, but the cold was relentless, clawing at the edges of the hut, creeping in through every crack and seam. It was as if nature itself was trying to reclaim the land, to bury him in its icy grip. The man's thoughts turned inward. He knew that survival wasn't just about shelter, it was about adaptation. Every time the storm changed direction, he had to adjust, had to think quickly. He had no choice but to embrace the challenge. If the wind could find a way in, he would find a way to hold it out. He wasn't ready to give up yet. For now, he would sit, wait, and listen to the storm outside. He would let it come, let it test his creation, but he wouldn't back down, not now. Not when the wind was still howling. The storm raged on, relentless and unyielding. The wind howled like a wild beast, tearing through the valley and sending snow swirling in chaotic gusts. The once serene landscape was now a battle zone, with the Quonset hut standing firm against nature's fury. Inside, the man struggled to maintain the warmth that had kept him alive for so long. It had been hours since he last stoked the fire, and already he could feel the temperature inside the hut beginning to dip. The wind outside was howling more fiercely, battering against the metal sheets, pushing through the cracks, forcing the cold to creep in from every corner. He could hear the creaking of the structure, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed shelter had its breaking point. His eyes darted to the fire, now reduced to a soft glow. He quickly moved over to the hearth, adding more wood, trying to coax the flames back into a warm, steady burn. The smoke billowed upward, twisting around the chimney, as if escaping the pressure of the storm. The warmth was fleeting, though. The cold was an ever-present threat. The man stood over the fire for a moment, rubbing his hands together, feeling the faint warmth seeping into his skin. The fire was his lifeline, but it wasn't enough to stave off the growing chill in the air. He could feel it, creeping in from every direction, seeping through the walls, seeping into his very bones. The longer the storm raged, the harder it became to hold the warmth inside. He stepped away from the fire and began pacing the small confines of the hut. Every step felt like a battle against the encroaching cold. His breath formed clouds in the air, and the feeling of numbness began to settle in. Despite his thick layers of clothing, he had lived through brutal winters before, but this was different. This was a fight for survival, a fight against nature itself. As the hours wore on, the man's mind began to wander. He thought about the decisions that had led him to this point. The Quonset hut, the untested design, the optimism that it would hold. He had trusted it, believed it would protect him. But now, as the cold began to seep in, the doubts crept forward. His hand reached for the fire again, adding another log to the pile, desperately trying to coax the warmth back. The fire flickered and sparked, but it was struggling against the cold, fighting a battle it couldn't win on its own. The man stood there, watching the flames dance, hoping that the heat would rise and hold him for just a little longer. He thought of the mountain men he had heard about, the ones who had lived through the worst winters, the ones who had survived with nothing more than their wits and their will. They had built cabins, shelters, homes that stood against the elements. But the man knew, deep down, that survival wasn't about building something perfect. It was about adapting, about learning how to work with what you had, no matter how imperfect it was. The storm outside continued to rage, and inside, the fire burned low. The man knew he couldn't afford to let it die. He needed it to survive, to keep the warmth inside the Quonset hut. But as the wind howled outside, he realized that the true test wasn't in keeping the hut warm. The true test was whether he could adapt, whether he could survive. And as the temperature continued to drop, he vowed that he would, whatever it took. The night was long. The wind battered against the Quonset hut like a beast trying to tear down the walls, its howling voices relentless. The man sat by the fire, staring into the dancing flames. The warmth it offered was fleeting, a momentary relief from the cold that had begun to settle deep into his bones. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, and the temperature was dropping again. Inside, the man pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, the thick wool offering little protection against the increasing chill. He had been battling the cold for hours, his body tired from the constant movement, the effort of feeding the fire, trying to keep the warmth inside. But the cold was like an old friend, always there, always creeping in, no matter how much he tried to fend it off. He looked over at the walls of the Quonset hut, watching the metal sheets shudder against the force of the wind. Despite the layers of snow and the insulation he had packed around the base, the cold had a way of finding its way in. It seeped through the cracks, curled around the edges, and found every weak spot. The metal walls, though sturdy, were no match for the kind of wind that could break through mountains. His mind was becoming clouded with exhaustion. He had slept little in the past few days, the constant vigilance wearing on him, but he couldn't afford to sleep now, not while the storm raged outside, not while the fire fought a losing battle against the freezing air. Every moment felt like a battle, each second stretching longer than the last, each breath a struggle to maintain the warmth that was slowly slipping away. The man closed his eyes for a moment, his head resting against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. He could hear the wind, feel it pressing against the hut, testing its strength, but he couldn't afford to let it in. He couldn't afford to let the cold consume him. He thought back to when he first built the hut. He had thought it would be enough. He had believed that with his design, with his efforts, he could create something that would withstand anything. But now, as the cold pressed in from every angle, he wasn't so sure. The elements were unpredictable, and no matter how much he prepared, he couldn't control them. The fire flickered low, and the man's heart sank. It wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough. But then, as if in defiance of the storm outside, the man stood. He couldn't let the fire die. He couldn't let the cold win. With a renewed sense of purpose, he stood and moved toward the hearth. He stoked the embers, adding more wood, trying once again to fight back the cold that seemed to be taking over. The flames flickered in protest, but they slowly grew, the warmth once again creeping into the room. For a moment the man allowed himself to relax, just a little. He could feel the warmth returning, the fire pushing back against the relentless cold. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. The storm outside still raged and the night was still long. But for now, he was warm. For now, he had won. And for now, that was enough. The first light of dawn seeped through the small, high window of the Quonset hut, casting a pale glow on the frost-covered interior. The wind had died down for the moment, and the world outside had returned to a frozen silence. But the man knew better than to trust the calm. It was only a temporary reprieve, a brief pause before the next wave of cold would come crashing in. Inside, the fire still burned, though weaker than it had been before. The embers were low, glowing faintly, and the warmth that had clung to the hut for so long was beginning to fade. The man sat near the hearth, watching the flames fight against the creeping chill. He rubbed his hands together, trying to revive the heat in his body, but the cold was starting to seep into his limbs, numbing his fingers and toes. The storm had been relentless over the past few days, and the snow had piled higher around the hut. He had spent hours digging out the doorway and clearing the path, but it was a losing battle. The snow fell faster than he could clear it. No matter how hard he worked, it always seemed to find its way back in, pushing against the walls, forcing its way under the door, and collecting in the corners. For the first time, he felt the weight of isolation. The days had blurred together, each one colder and longer than the last. He had come here to survive, to prove that he could make it in this unforgiving wilderness, but now he wasn't sure if he could hold on much longer. The Quonset hut had held strong against the wind, but it was struggling to keep the cold at bay. The fire was a constant source of hope, but it was no longer enough to chase the cold out completely. He stood up and moved to the door, pulling on his thick gloves before unlatching it. The cold air hit him like a wall as soon as he stepped outside. The snow was deeper now, almost up to his waist. The world beyond the hut was a barren wasteland of white, the landscape barely visible through the thick, swirling snowflakes. The wind, though calm for the moment, was sure to pick up again. It always did. He looked back at the Quonset hut, its curved metal shape barely visible through the snowdrifts. It seemed small, fragile in comparison to the vast wilderness surrounding it. The man let out a breath, his exhale visible in the freezing air. He had survived this far, but for how much longer? He moved back inside, the cold already seeping into his bones, and sat by the fire. The warmth was fleeting, not enough to fight off the persistent cold that clung to him like a shadow. He had been here too long. The fire was dwindling, and he was growing weary. This wasn't just a battle against the elements. It was a battle against his own body, against exhaustion and hunger and the ever-present chill. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up this fight. As the fire flickered low, The man let his head fall back against the wall. His eyes drifted closed for a moment, and in the silence of the hut, he allowed himself to rest. The cold still pressed against the walls, still gnawed at his body, but he couldn't give in. Not yet. He would survive this. He had to. The days stretched on, each one colder than the last. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered. The wind had calmed, and the snow had settled, but the cold was relentless. The man found himself growing weaker each day, his energy slowly draining away as he struggled to keep the fire alive, to keep the warmth inside the Quonset hut. He had begun rationing his food, carefully measuring out what little supplies he had left. The fur-lined coat he had been wearing for days was starting to feel thin and inadequate. His body ached from the constant battle with the cold, the exhaustion wearing him down in ways he hadn't expected. His once strong hands were now stiff and numb from the cold, and every movement felt like a struggle. But despite the overwhelming fatigue, something inside him refused to let go. The Quonset hut, though battered by the storm, was still standing. The fire, though flickering and weak, still provided enough warmth to keep the cold at bay. It wasn't much, but it was something, and for the man, that was enough. One morning, as he woke to the dim light filtering through the window, something felt different. The air inside the hut was warmer than it had been in days. He opened his eyes and looked around, blinking against the morning light. The fire was burning again, stronger than it had been, casting a warm glow on the walls. The embers were alive, the crackling sound of burning wood filling the otherwise quiet space. For a moment, the man was still, his breath catching in his throat. It was the first time in what felt like forever that the warmth inside had felt stable, constant. He stood up slowly, testing his legs, and moved toward the fire. The warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, chasing the lingering cold from his body. He bent down, adding more wood to the fire, carefully coaxing the flames higher. As the fire grew, so did his hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that survival was possible, that he could endure. The storm had come and gone, but the real test had been his ability to adapt, to survive in the face of nature's harshest challenges. And here, in the warmth of the fire, he realized that he was still standing. The Quonset hut had held against the storm, and now it was holding him together. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The cold was still out there, still lurking beyond the walls of his shelter. But in this moment, he had won. The fire was his victory, it was his life, and he was determined to keep it burning. Days passed in a rhythm of fire, food, and fleeting moments of warmth. The storms had become less frequent, but the cold still lingered, an ever-present reminder that the wilderness would never truly let him go. The man had learned to live with it, the silence, the isolation, the perpetual fight to keep the warmth inside his Quonset hut. Outside, the snow was beginning to compact, the soft, powdery snow of the earlier storm, now a thick crust, glistening under the weak light of the late afternoon. The landscape, though beautiful, was harsh. The world beyond the hut was inhospitable, a world that would claim him if he let his guard down. The fire had become more than just a source of warmth. It was a symbol of his survival, a reminder that he was still here, still fighting. But even the strongest flames would eventually burn out if not properly tended to. He had learned this the hard way. The man moved toward the hearth again, adding more kindling to the fire. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if every action took twice the energy it should. The cold had begun to take a toll on him, his body aching with every step, his limbs stiff and slow. The fire crackled and sparked, but it wasn't enough to completely chase away the chill in the air. The warmth from the hearth felt distant now, not as comforting as it once had been. He stepped back from the fire, his eyes scanning the hut, looking for signs of weakness. The metal walls, though sturdy, had started to show signs of wear. The edges of the Quonset hut, where the steel met the rock, had begun to corrode slightly from the moisture in the air. The man frowned, his mind racing. It wasn't much, but it was a warning. The hut was still standing, but for how long? His fingers were numb from the cold, despite the thick gloves he wore, and his breath came in shallow bursts. It wasn't just the cold that made him tired. It was the isolation, the constant vigilance. He hadn't seen another soul in weeks, and his thoughts had begun to wander in ways they never had before. The isolation was wearing on him. He missed the sound of human voices, the feeling of company, but that was the price of survival. He had chosen this life, and now he had to make it work. With a weary sigh, he turned from the fire and walked to the small shelf where his supplies were stored. The food was nearly gone, and he had to ration carefully. His body, though weakened, still had enough strength to keep moving, to keep fighting. But he knew that his time here was limited. He couldn't survive on firewood and warmth alone. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, a crack, sharp and loud. He turned quickly, his heart racing. The fire had flickered, the log splitting under the heat. It was a minor thing, a small interruption, but it felt like more. His life, he realized, was just like that log, slowly breaking down little by little. He moved toward the fire, adding more wood. The warmth surged again, but the man knew better than to trust it completely. The battle was ongoing, and it would not stop until he had won. The days had turned into weeks, and the relentless cycle of survival had begun to wear thin on the man. Each day felt like a repetition of the last, waking, tending to the fire, searching for food, making sure the Quonset hut stood against the changing winds. There was no respite from the harshness of the wilderness. Even the moments of warmth inside the hut seemed fleeting, like dreams slipping through his fingers. Outside, the snow had hardened into a thick, almost impenetrable crust. It was no longer the powdery, light snow of the earlier storms, but a heavy, compacted layer that was difficult to traverse. The man had tried, in the past few days, to venture further out, but the deep snow made it almost impossible to move quickly. His food supply was running low, and though the fire kept him warm, he couldn't survive solely on the warmth of the hut. His body had grown weaker, despite his best efforts to keep up with the demands of survival. He had learned to ration his food, but it was never enough. His muscles were sore from constant work, and his stomach ached with hunger. The isolation, the solitude, had begun to take a toll on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Yet there was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. A small, nagging feeling in the back of his mind that kept him moving forward, kept him pushing through the discomfort and the fear. It was the knowledge that he had chosen this, that survival, though hard, was still within his grasp. There was no room for self-pity here, no time for weakness. He had a task, to stay alive, and he was determined to fulfill it. One morning, after a particularly brutal night when the temperature had plummeted well below freezing, he stepped outside the hut and made his way toward the ridge. The snow beneath his boots was thick, and each step felt like a monumental effort. But he didn't stop. The cold stung his face, and his breath was visible in the air, but he kept moving, knowing that the land had become just as unforgiving as the storm that had passed. His goal wasn't to find a new shelter or even to fix the Quonset hut. It was to test himself, to see if he could still push through, to remind himself that he was still strong enough to survive. The ridge was a few hundred yards away, and though the wind had died down, the cold still made the journey feel endless. He paused to catch his breath, his body trembling with the exertion. The exhaustion was starting to settle in, but he didn't stop. His mind was clear in that moment, the noise of the world gone. There was only the sound of his breathing, the crunch of snow beneath his boots, and the vast, empty wilderness around him. He reached the ridge and stood there, looking out over the valley. The land stretched endlessly before him, a sea of white with only the peaks of distant mountains rising above the horizon. It was beautiful, but it was also a stark reminder of how small he was in the face of it all. But for the first time in days, he didn't feel completely alone. The land, the mountains, the endless wilderness, it had become a part of him. He had fought against it, but in that moment, he realized that it wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding, about learning how to exist within the chaos, how to move forward even when the odds seemed impossible. He turned and began the trek back to the hut, his pace slower now. The fire would be waiting, his shelter still standing, and for today, that was enough. The days were growing longer, but the cold still held a tight grip on the land. The snow that had once been soft and fluffy had compacted into a frozen crust, and the wind had returned with a vengeance, sweeping across the mountains with little mercy. The storm that had battered the Quonset hut days earlier had passed, but the effects of that brutal force remained. The world outside the hut was a frozen expanse, uninviting and harsh. Inside, however, the man found a small measure of peace. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth, its warmth a familiar comfort in the otherwise cold, desolate space. The heat, though not overwhelming, was enough to stave off the worst of the chill. He had become accustomed to its ebb and flow, the way the warmth would rise and fall as the fire slowly consumed the wood, only to be replenished again by his hands. He sat near the hearth, his knees drawn up to his chest, staring into the flames. The firelight danced and flickered, casting shadows that swayed along the walls of the Quonset hut. The quiet crackling was the only sound that filled the small space. The rhythmic pop and snap of the burning logs was oddly soothing, a simple reminder that even in the harshest of environments, life could still find a way to exist. The man had spent the last several days recovering from his trek to the ridge, his body sore and aching, his muscles still stiff from the exertion. The cold had a way of seeping into your bones even when you tried to ignore it. But now, in the stillness of the hut, he allowed himself a rare moment of rest. His eyes were heavy from exhaustion, but he didn't close them just yet. He was afraid that if he did, the peace he had found would slip away. The warmth in the hut was a fragile thing, and he knew it wouldn't last forever. The fire would eventually burn out, and the cold would creep back in. But for now, the world outside was muffled, as if the storm had paused just for a moment to give him some reprieve. His thoughts drifted to the past, to the life he had left behind before the mountains and the isolation. There had been family, friends, a life filled with noise and chaos, but out here in the stillness, all of that seemed far away. The wilderness had a way of stripping away everything, leaving you with only what you needed to survive. And for the man, survival had become both the challenge and the reward. The fire was beginning to dwindle now, the embers glowing faintly as he added another log to the pile. He stood up slowly, his stiff legs protesting the movement, and walked over to the small stack of wood he had carefully gathered in the corner. The snow outside had stopped falling, but he knew that wouldn't last. There would be more storms ahead. The fire was his shield, his constant companion, and it would continue to demand his attention. But as he stoked the fire once more, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on how far he had come. He had survived this long, and with each passing day, he felt a little more like the land was no longer something to fear. It was something to understand, something to coexist with. For a brief moment the world outside seemed less threatening. The fire crackled, and the warmth filled the hut. The man closed his eyes, allowing himself to rest. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was enough. The silence was louder than the storm. The wind had returned, howling and roaring like a beast outside the Quonset hut. The snow had started to fall again, and the man could hear it slapping against the metal roof. The rhythmic beat of the snow hitting the metal was maddening in its consistency. His eyes flicked to the fire, still crackling in the corner, the warmth it offered barely enough to combat the ever-encroaching cold. This time, he wasn't sure if the hut would hold. The storm outside was growing more fierce with each passing hour, and the wind felt different this time, sharper, colder, more unforgiving. The snow was accumulating faster than he could clear it, and the heavy winds were pushing against the walls of the Quonset hut with a ferocity that made the structure groan in protest. The metallic squeals of the hut as it shifted in the wind seemed almost human, as if the shelter itself was crying out. He pulled his thick coat tighter around him, huddling near the fire. His body was tired, drained by the constant battle against the cold, the hunger, and the isolation. It had been weeks since he had seen another living soul, and in that time the loneliness had begun to seep into his bones. The solitude was no longer peaceful, it had become oppressive. Every sound outside the hut felt like a threat. Every creak of the metal walls felt like a warning. He was becoming more aware of the fragility of his shelter, his fragile existence, and the ever-present uncertainty of survival. The fire had been his constant companion, his lifeline in the cold. But even now, as he stoked the flames and added another log, he wasn't sure if it was enough. The storm outside was relentless, and the fire was beginning to feel like an illusion, a flicker of warmth in a world that seemed to grow colder with each passing day. The hut, despite its sturdiness, wasn't invincible, and neither was he. For the first time he wondered if he had made a mistake. Had his decision to stay in the mountains, to endure this isolation, been foolish? The struggle to survive had taken a toll on him in ways he hadn't expected. The constant battle against the elements, the harsh reality of loneliness, had drained him. His body was weakening, and his mind was starting to fray. He couldn't remember the last time he had slept soundly, the last time he had felt truly at peace. A sharp gust of wind rattled the hut, and the man jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood quickly, his movements stiff from exhaustion, and moved toward the door. His breath formed a mist in the air as he opened it, stepping out into the storm. The snow was thick now, swirling in the wind, and the world outside was a blur of white. He pushed forward, his boots sinking into the deep snow, his body moving on instinct rather than thought. The wind cut through him like a knife, biting at his skin and seeping into his very bones. The storm was getting worse, but he couldn't go back yet. Not yet. He kept moving, his steps growing slower, his body more fatigued with each passing moment. The cold was becoming unbearable, and he felt the weight of the wilderness pressing in around him. The hut was still there, still standing, but in that moment it felt far away. The man wasn't sure if it was the storm that was breaking him or if it was something deeper. The isolation, the fatigue, the relentless struggle for survival. As he trudged through the snow, the thought lingered in his mind. How much longer could he keep this up? How much longer could the hut hold? And how much longer could he survive this fight against the wilderness? The storm had not stopped, but the man had. His steps were slower now, his movements stiff from fatigue. The snow, now up to his knees, had become an insurmountable wall, and the wind battered him from every direction. Every breath felt like it was freezing inside his chest. He had wandered out too far, unsure of his purpose, only the need to escape the pressure of being confined in the Quonset hut. His body trembled and his vision blurred. The cold was creeping in, taking over his thoughts, and he was fighting to keep his footing in the deep snow. But in that moment, a thought struck him. He needed to survive. He needed to get back. Turning, he forced his legs to carry him back toward the shelter. The wind howled louder, cutting into his skin. Each step felt like a monumental effort, but the sight of the Quonset hut through the swirling snow was his only anchor. He had to reach it. Finally, he reached the door, stumbling inside. The fire inside the hut had burned low, but it was still alive. The faintest spark remained, and with a few quick adjustments, he added kindling. It flared up immediately, warmth pushing back against the cold that had infiltrated his body. In that moment, the man realized just how fragile life had become. The storm was still raging, but the fire had survived. As the warmth slowly spread through his limbs, he knew that, despite everything, he wasn't ready to give up just yet. The fire crackled, its warmth now spreading through the hut, and for the first time in days, the man felt something close to relief. But that feeling was fleeting. The storm was still fierce outside, and the weight of the wilderness still hung heavy in his chest. He knew it was only a matter of time before another challenge arose. He stared at the fire, his thoughts drifting. The isolation had worn on him, each passing day feeling like an eternity. He had endured so much already, the cold, the hunger, the storms, but it wasn't the elements that were breaking him. It was the quiet, the loneliness, the ever-present fear that survival was only temporary. As the fire burned, he realized something. Survival wasn't just about holding on. It was about accepting the uncertainty, the knowledge that nothing was permanent. He had to learn to live with the constant change, the constant fight. The storm raged on, but inside the man felt a spark of something more than survival. It was resolve. He wasn't ready to give in, not yet. Not while the fire still burned. The storm had begun to wane, but the cold was as relentless as ever. The wind, though less fierce, still whispered through the cracks in the Quonset hut, reminding the man of the harsh world beyond. The fire crackled in the corner, its warmth a steady comfort, but the man's body, though nourished by the heat, felt hollow. Days blended into one another, and the solitude had become a constant weight. He had learned to rely on the rhythm of the fire, the crackling of logs, and the faint glow that kept the darkness at bay. Yet there was a growing exhaustion, physical and mental. His limbs ached from the cold and hard labor, and his mind had become a tangle of doubts. Was he doing enough to survive? Was this his life now? Simply enduring? Despite the weariness, something inside him refused to break. The spark of determination had not died, even if it flickered at times. Each day he moved forward, inching closer to a fragile sense of peace. He rose slowly, his legs stiff from sitting too long by the fire. The storm had passed, but the silence it left was a heavy presence. He could hear the soft creaking of the hut, the occasional pop of burning wood, and, for a brief moment, the world outside felt a little less threatening. There was something peaceful in the simplicity of this life. It wasn't easy, nor was it without fear. But he had learned that survival wasn't about being invincible. It was about finding strength in the moments of quiet, the moments when you refused to give up. The storm had finally relented, and the world outside was still. The wind had ceased, leaving a peaceful hush in its wake. Snow had blanketed the landscape, turning everything into a soft, untouched canvas. Inside the Quonset hut, the fire burned steadily, its warmth enough to fill the room with a sense of comfort. The man sat by the hearth, staring into the flames, his mind calm for the first time in what felt like weeks. The past months had been a trial, a test of endurance, of willpower, and of the strength to push through the harshest of conditions. But now, as he sat there, he realized that survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about resilience, about adapting and finding peace in the struggle. The hut, though battered by storms and the weight of time, had proven its worth, and so had he. He had faced the wilderness, the isolation, and the unrelenting cold, but he had remained. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the stillness, a quiet testament to his survival. The man closed his eyes, letting the warmth wash over him. It wasn't the end, not by any means. The wilderness still held its dangers, and survival was never guaranteed. But for now, in this moment, he was at peace. The struggle, the fear, the doubt, it was all part of the journey. And as the fire's glow flickered in the quiet hut, he knew that he had won, not by defeating the wilderness, but by learning to live with it. Tomorrow the journey would continue, but tonight he could rest.